Merry Christmas Eve. I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News. The Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs have hired a law firm to look into systemic racism against First Nations people by the Winnipeg Police Service. This comes just days after an alleged altercation between as many as 5 officers and 1 First Nations man last Thursday. With more, here's T.R. Wheatley.
That's the million-dollar question.
Chad Panting is a lawyer hired to look at whether racism played a factor in how Winnipeg police handled an incident involving Larry Beardy's son, Chad Beardy, during the early morning hours of December 19 on Furby Street.
I think racism is a big factor. Racism, and people don't understand. They're deliberately ignorant.
Beardy of the Tatasqueyak Cree Nation has the support of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, who have asked Panting of Cassidy Law Firm to look into the arrest of Chad Beardy. Winnipeg police say they received a report of a male and female arguing where one of the parties was armed with an edged weapon and attempting to stab the other. Police say when they arrived, the male was outside and armed. After he refused verbal warnings, he began walking towards them when a taser was used. The family and the lawyer say different, saying Chad didn't have a weapon in his hand when he was tased.
Why does the police force 5 people deliberately injure my son? Now, I don't know. My son works in construction. I don't know what condition he's going to be in after this. You know, if he'll be able to go back to the career that he loves to do.
The Independent Investigation Unit of Manitoba is investigating. In their media release, information pretty similar to what WPS said. There was one new detail that said the male had fallen on ice. The family's lawyer disputes this.
He didn't fall on ice. They physically assaulted him and broke his leg in 2 places. His fibula and his tibia have been completely broken, and he's now awaiting surgery.
The father admits Chad and his partner have history with domestic violence, but says no one called the police that night. The lawyer says even so, Chad's identity was never known.
He wasn't even identified at the incident. So how would the police be able to factor that into their assessment of the risk? It was based on his appearance.
Once in custody, Chad Beardy was taken to hospital where he waited up to 16 hours for medical attention. Chad is awaiting surgery and his court appearance is February 11. In the meantime, the law firm is working on filing complaints with the Law Enforcement Review Agency. A civil claim against police will also be filed. And both the family and Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs remain adamant that a national inquiry into police needs to happen. T.R. Wheatley, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Both the Winnipeg Police and Manitoba's Independent Investigation Unit were contacted, but both say they do not comment on ongoing investigations. The Yukon Water Board is allowing the receiver for a contaminated mine site in the Yukon to temporarily discharge cyanide-impacted water into a nearby creek. Price Waterhouse Coopers is the receiver for Victoria Gold's Eagle Gold Mine. The mine is located on the First Nation of Nacho-Nyaktun's traditional territory. Earlier this year, a heap leach failure caused cyanide-laced material to be released into the surrounding environment. The mine's receiver says the site's current facilities can't treat cyanide-impacted water to the standards in its license. The amendment will be in place until the spring when upgrades to its facilities are complete. Nacho-Nyaktun said in a submission to the board last month it wasn't happy about the proposed amendment, but understood the rationale behind it. The province of Ontario is asking the Supreme Court to hear a case that could clarify the obligations of governments to fight climate change. 7 young people allege Ontario's weakened emissions target violated their right to life. They also allege they're being discriminated against because young people will bear the brunt of the impacts of climate change. Ontario's lawyers are asking the court to determine whether the Canadian Charter imposes obligations on governments to fight climate change and to what extent. The U.S. Senate has unanimously approved the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policies Act of 2024. The bill would establish a federal commission similar to Canada's TRC to investigate the country's Indian boarding school system. The bill was first introduced in May 2023 by Democrat Senator Elizabeth Warren. In addition to investigating the system, it would develop policy recommendations and implement a healing process for survivors, descendants, and communities. A bill of the same name was introduced in the House of Representatives by Democrat Sharice Davids in February this year. On Friday, the Senate bill passed with support from both sides. Next, it must pass in the House of Representatives to become law. Indigenous advocacy organizations, including the National Congress of American Indians, are calling for swift action from House leadership. Senator Brian Schatz is the chair of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs.
It is no small task for us to confront the unbearable burden of our history. Yet to stand before that history in silence, to remain idle while these wounds persist, is to turn away from one of the most fundamental acts of justice and healing that we are in a position to do something about. We have to turn the light on and let the truth out. And this is the work that we've done in the Senate now, and we do hope the House takes action and passes this incredibly important measure into law.
Coming up after the break, we'll take a look back on the year that was in Alberta. Stick around. Welcome back. It was a tough year for Justin Trudeau and his Liberal government in Ottawa in 2024. The Liberals were under attack from all sides, including on Indigenous issues. Whether it was funding for child welfare services or searches for unmarked graves, few stakeholder groups were happy with the Liberals by year's end. APTN's Fraser Needham has that story.
The year started with a major Supreme Court decision. Canada's top court ruled against Quebec's constitutional challenge of Bill C-92 in early February. This is the law that gives Indigenous communities full control over welfare services that affect their children and families. Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief for Quebec and Labrador, Ghislain Picard, said it was a day of bittersweet emotions.
It's a very beautiful, happy decision by the Supreme Court, but it is also, in a way, a sad day that the well-being and the future of these children has been an issue debated before the courts for the past 4 years and beyond.
Well, Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hajdu said the ruling recognizes both the legitimacy of the federal law and the right of Indigenous people to manage services that affect their children.
This decision by the Supreme Court to uphold that inherent right, to recognize the legitimacy of federal law, to bolster that right and to place that right in Canadian law, I think is going to have tremendous impact across the country.
Yet for much of the year, First Nations were at odds with the federal government when it came to funding for these very same child services. In July, at an AFN Special Chiefs Assembly in Montreal, National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Nepenak announced she had signed a $47.8 billion proposed agreement with the Trudeau government for long-term reform in the First Nations child welfare system. The agreement was also endorsed by the Chiefs of Ontario, Anishinaabe-Aski Nation. However, it was soon met with heavy criticism from the organizations like the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, who said the agreement had been signed without enough consultation and funding was not guaranteed if there was a change in government. At another AFN assembly in Calgary in October, Chiefs voted the agreement down.
Sorry, draft resolution number 1 does not carry, so he's defeated.
The federal government was also under fire for not meeting its Jordan's Principle obligations. The principle says First Nations children should be able to get products, services, and supports when they need them. But a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal hearing in Ottawa in September heard the government is now backlogged with tens of thousands of unprocessed requests. A significant number of these requests are urgent and supposed to be processed within 12 hours. The government told the tribunal it's overwhelmed by the sheer volume of Jordan's Principle requests in recent years. But Cindy Blackstock, the executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, had little sympathy for this argument.
I mean, governments their job is to do complicated things. Governments, for example, they rolled out vaccines for thousands of people. They collect taxes from millions of Canadians. They do international types of work. All of those things are important. So is meeting the needs of First Nations kids. They've had now 8 years since the order.
The Liberal government was also taken to task for not properly funding searches for unmarked graves related to residential schools. At a press conference in Ottawa on National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, Laura Arndt of the Survivors Secretariat had these words for the Prime Minister.
We've had enough. Promises only matter when you keep them, so keep your promise. Do it for the communities, do it for this country, so that they may know what real reconciliation looks like. And most importantly, do it for the survivors who lived through this nightmare and who for 60, 70, and sometimes 80 years have fought for the truth to be told about those who didn't come home.
The Secretariat said the federal budget had reduced funding for searches from $216.6 million since 2021 to $91 million over the next 2 years. The need for the federal government to provide long-term sufficient and flexible funding for searches was also a key recommendation of Special Interlocutor for Missing Children, Unmarked Graves and Burial Sites, Kimberly Murray's final report released at the end of October. The year ended with Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Gary-Anna Sondegree's announcement in committee that the federal government would not be moving forward on Bill C-53.
As you know, there was a court decision relating to the Métis Nation of Alberta, and there was also a decision by the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan to pull out of that process. And consequently, I'm respecting those two separate but I think related conclusions. And as a result, C-53 will not be moving forward.
The invalid legislation was supposed to formally recognize Métis governments in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario, but had been facing heavy pushback for more than a year from First Nations on Ontario and the Manitoba Métis Federation, who do not see the Métis Nation of Ontario as a legitimate organization. The bill had been dealt further blows earlier this year when the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan withdrew its support and the court ruled not all Métis communities in Alberta had been properly consulted before the legislation was drafted. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
There were many important moments in 2024 in the province of Alberta, from the devastating fire in Jasper to the rejection of the $47.8 billion child reform deal. APTN's Chris Stewart has a wrap-up of the year.
On January 10th, Indigenous reporter Brandy Morin was arrested by Edmonton police while covering the dismantling of a houseless camp. Police said she refused to leave the taped-off area where police were working. She was held for 5 hours and charged with obstruction of a police officer. The charge was dropped March 1st.
I always knew that there was risk of arrest because of the type of stories that I cover, but until it happens to you, you don't understand the emotional and psychological impact that it has on you. And I think that it is a tactic that they use to send that message, to impede, to insult, discredit, and to intimidate the media.
In April, hundreds of community members, leaders from across Canada, family, and friends helped accomplished Grand Chief Wilton Littlechild celebrate his 80th birthday in the Enoch Cree Nation.
Sharing the evening with family, I think it really is touching because in residential school, of course, that was the impact, was separation of family. And to have everyone come together as families and then as a community family is just really special.
In July, a devastating wildfire raged through Jasper National Park, destroying almost 33,000 hectares of forest and 30%, 1/3 of the buildings in the town of Jasper, including homes, a historic church, and bridges.
And to those in Alberta and around the world who have experienced the magic of Jasper, the magic is not lost and it never will be. Alberta's government will provide the support needed to families and community to recover and to rebuild stronger than ever.
In late August, 15-year-old Haas Lightning was shot and killed by RCMP officers in Wetaskiwin after he called 911 for help. RCMP said they had to use deadly force in a confrontation with Lightning even though he surrendered what they say were his weapons as he was ordered to. The Alberta Serious Incident Response Team is investigating.
I don't think he was out to hurt anyone. He was scared. That's why he called the police for help. And how does a call for help turn into you getting killed by the police that you called for help? It doesn't make sense.
On September 17th, 42-year-old John Wells from the Blood Tribe in southern Alberta died after an altercation with Calgary police. He was punched, tasered multiple times, and injected with a sedative. He died at the scene. The Alberta Serious Incident Response Team is investigating that incident as well. In October, the AFN held a special Chiefs Assembly in Calgary, where after 3 days of discussion, the majority of Chiefs voted against a $4.8 billion child welfare reform deal. Cindy Blackstock said the vote sent a clear message to Ottawa.
This is a vote for children. And what is the most inspiring thing is that children should know how many people, how many of their leaders love them enough to come here and spend these days having these difficult conversations and making a very difficult decision. I think this is a great opportunity now to reset and make sure that the discrimination stops against First Nations children all over Canada, that it never happens again all over Canada, and that we ensure that every penny goes to maximum value for children and families.
In November, 65-year-old Elvis Wakinu from the Samson Cree Nation told APTN that the furnace in his new home was not working, and he was living in a freezing house for almost a month. With temperatures falling, he said band leadership had failed to help him.
Sometimes I go sit in my vehicle and try and warm up, especially in the night. So if only there could be help.
A day or two after our story aired, his furnace was repaired, and he is now living comfortably at home. In November, the Alberta Child Advocate released annual reports that show Indigenous youth still being vastly overrepresented in the provincial child welfare system. And 64% of youth who died or were seriously injured in that system in the past year were Indigenous.
Having Indigenous communities be at the helm and in the lead of their own process, of their own sovereignty, healing, reunification, family prevention, is critical to reducing the numbers of Indigenous children in care.
And that is a highlight of some of the stories in Alberta in 2024. Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Edmonton.
Thanks, Chris. Time now to take a look at this week's web poll questions. Should Chiefs be held to a higher standard? Yes, no, or unsure. Would charging healthcare workers with a crime eliminate braid cutting in hospitals? Yes, no, or unsure. And do you think 2025 will be less or more politically charged than 2024? Your options: more politically charged, less politically charged, or same amount? You can weigh in by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. The federal government has given the go-ahead for Santa to enter Canadian airspace. More on that after the break. Welcome back. Here's a look at your current conditions. -9 in Fredericton, -1 in Halifax. -22 in Kuujjuaq, 15 below in Nain. -8 with snow in Montreal, flurries and 12 below in Chibougamau. -6 in Sault Ste. Marie, snow and -9 in North Bay. -9 in Thunder Bay, 13 below in Sioux Lookout. -7 in God's Lake, snow and -9 for Norway House. -8 in Winnipeg, sun's out and 3 below in Dauphin. -11 in Regina and Saskatoon. -9 in Meadow Lake, 5 below in La Ronge. In northern Alberta, snow and -4 in High Level, +2 in Peace River. +4 in Edmonton, 9 above in Lethbridge. +9 in Vancouver, 10 in Victoria. 6 in Prince George, snowy and 4 in Smithers. -17 in Old Crow, 2 below in Whitehorse. -13 with snow in Yellowknife, 20 below in Wrigley. -21 with snow in Sax Harbor, flurries and 14 below in Paulatuck. Snow and 13 below for Chesterfield and Whale Cove. Minus 23 in Resolute and Joe Haven. The Yukon's very own hockey prodigy Gavin McKenna will be playing in the World Juniors starting on Boxing Day in Ottawa. McKenna is from Whitehorse and is a citizen of the Trondak-Gwich'in First Nation. He's a forward with the Medicine Hat Tigers and leading the Western Hockey League with 19 goals and 41 assists for 60 points in just 30 games so far this season. He's one of 8 16-year-olds to represent Canada at the World Junior Championship, though he just turned 17 on Friday. Happy birthday. Canada plays its first game against Finland on Thursday at 7:30 Eastern Time. Good news for kids in Canada. Santa's sleigh has been cleared for travel in Canadian airspace. Transportation Minister Anita Anand says she has engaged with her elves and reviewed several key documents, including Santa's flight plan. Anand also met with Santa for the first time since she became Transportation Minister. Children can track Santa and his reindeer on Christmas Eve using the NORAD website. Traveling by turboprop instead of the traditional sleigh and reindeer, Santa and his elves have been crisscrossing northern Manitoba since the start of this week, bringing warm Christmas cheer to 22 First Nations. The smiling faces of dozens of happy children greeted Santa and the Santa Express as they made their appointed rounds this year. It's a holiday season partnership between MKO and Perimeter Airways that's now in its 15th year. Among the communities visited were Tuduli Lake, Lac Rochette, South Indian Lake, and York Factory First Nation. MKO Grand Chief Garrison Satie says even after 15 years witnessing the joy the Santa Express brings to children and adults in northern communities never gets old.
We do it because, we're impacting the lives of young people, we're impacting the lives of children, and I know that in the northern communities we need to continue to ensure that the children have something good happening in their lives and also bringing inspiration to the kids is very important.
Satie says although 22 MKO First Nation communities had a visit from the Santa Express this year, his organization hopes to grow that number in the coming years. Beautiful. Well, that's all the time we have for your APTN National News on this Christmas Eve. You can stay up to date with the very latest, of course, by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Marcy Miigwech, thanks for being with us today and all year. We'll be airing new specials over the next week and returning here on January 2nd. From all of us here at APTN News, have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.